Picture this: a war that's been raging for over half a century, consuming billions of taxpayer dollars, destroying countless lives, and tearing apart entire communities. But what if I told you that the very people who declared this war might have been secretly fueling the enemy they claimed to be fighting? What if the government agencies tasked with protecting American citizens were actually complicit in flooding the streets with the deadliest substances imaginable? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial and explosive stories in American history. A tale that involves presidential administrations, shadowy intelligence operations, and a web of lies so intricate that it makes the most twisted conspiracy theories look like children's bedtime stories. This is the dark truth behind the war on drugs, and trust me, what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view the relationship between your government and the communities it swore to protect. But before we unravel this nightmare, we need to go back to where it all began. June 1971. When President Richard Nixon stood before the American people and made a declaration that would echo through the decades. Nixon announced that drug abuse had become America's public enemy number one, launching what would become known as the War on Drugs. On the surface, this seemed like a noble crusade, a president taking decisive action to protect his citizens from the growing threat of narcotics. However, what Nixon didn't tell the American people was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just about public health or safety. This was about power, control, and maintaining political dominance through any means necessary. The war on drugs became the perfect weapon to target specific communities while maintaining the facade of legitimate law enforcement. The policies that emerged from this declaration were brutal and unforgiving. Mandatory minimum prison sentences were imposed for even minor drug offenses, creating a system that would eventually incarcerate millions of Americans. By the end of 2023, approximately 1.8 million Americans were locked behind bars, with 1 in 5 imprisoned for drug-related crimes, many for nothing more than simple possession or even suspected possession. But here's where the story takes a truly disturbing turn. In 1994, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, gave an interview that pulled back the curtain on the true motivations behind this so-called war. What he revealed was nothing short of a calculated attack on American democracy itself. According to Ehrlichman, the war on drugs was never really about drugs at all. It was about eliminating Nixon's political opposition through systematic persecution. The target? 2 groups that posed a threat to Nixon's grip on power, the anti-war left and Black Americans. These communities had become increasingly vocal in their opposition to Nixon's policies, particularly regarding the Vietnam War and civil rights. Rather than address their legitimate concerns, Nixon chose to wage war against them through the criminal justice system. Ehrlichman's confession was chilling in its honesty. He admitted that they couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or to be Black, but they could criminalize the substances they associated with these communities. By linking hippies with marijuana and Black Americans with heroin, then heavily criminalizing both substances, they could systematically dismantle these movements. They could arrest leaders, raid homes, break up meetings, and vilify entire communities night after night on the evening news. The most damning part of Ehrlichman's revelation: they knew they were lying about the drugs from the very beginning. This wasn't a misguided policy based on incomplete information. This was a deliberate deception designed to destroy political opposition while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement. For a brief period in the mid-70s, it seemed like sanity might prevail. Between 1973 and 1977, some states actually decriminalized marijuana possession. When Jimmy Carter became president in 1977, he ran on a platform that included decriminalizing marijuana, and the Senate Judiciary Committee even voted to decriminalize possession of up to 1 ounce. It wasn't much, but it represented a step away from the destructive policies of the Nixon era. However, this glimmer of hope was about to be extinguished in the most devastating way possible. When Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency following the 1980 election, he didn't just continue Nixon's war on drugs, he supercharged it with a vengeance that would make the original policies look tame by comparison. Reagan expanded and reinforced many of Nixon's earlier policies, pushing for even more severe penalties for drug-related crimes at both the congressional and state levels. This created an explosion in incarceration rates for nonviolent drug offenses that continues to devastate communities today. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act established mandatory minimum prison sentences that revealed the true racist nature of these policies. The law created a shocking disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentences, a disparity that wasn't accidental but deliberately designed to target specific communities. While someone caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine would face a mandatory 5-year prison sentence, it would take 500 grams of powder cocaine to trigger the same punishment. This wasn't coincidence. This was systematic racism codified into law. Why this massive disparity? Because crack cocaine was predominantly found in Black American communities, while powder cocaine was more commonly used among white Americans. The same drug, processed differently, carried wildly different penalties based on which community was more likely to use each form. This created a 2-tiered justice system that destroyed Black families while treating white drug users with relative leniency. But as devastating as these policies were, they were only the beginning of a story that would become even more twisted and unbelievable, because the question that nobody was asking at the time was perhaps the most important one of all. Where was all this crack cocaine actually coming from? The answer to that question would lead investigators down a rabbit hole that stretched from the streets of Los Angeles to the jungles of Central America, involving secret government operations, international drug cartels, and a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of American intelligence agencies. The trail that investigators would eventually uncover reads like something straight out of a Hollywood thriller, except the consequences were devastatingly real for millions of Americans. To understand how crack cocaine flooded American cities in the 1980s, we need to shift our focus thousands of miles away from the urban streets where families were being torn apart, and instead look toward the political chaos unfolding in Central America. In 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front successfully overthrew Nicaragua's brutal dictator, establishing a socialist government that immediately caught the attention of Cold War strategists in Washington. For the Reagan administration, this represented an unacceptable expansion of Soviet influence in America's backyard. The response was swift and predictable. The CIA began secretly funding and arming a collection of right-wing paramilitary groups known as the Contras. These weren't freedom fighters, despite Reagan's glowing descriptions of them. These were brutal extremists who conducted a vicious campaign of terror against the Nicaraguan people, all while receiving millions of dollars in weapons and training from American intelligence agencies. Reagan himself stood before Congress and declared that cutting off support to these groups would hand the Soviets one of their greatest foreign policy victories since World War II. But here's where this story takes a turn that even the most cynical observers didn't see coming. In 1982, Democrats in Congress had seen enough of this shadow war and passed legislation cutting off official support to the Nicaraguan rebels. You might think this would have ended American involvement in this bloody conflict. You would be wrong. The CIA and their Contra allies didn't abandon their mission. They just got creative about funding it. And what they discovered was that there was one business that could generate the massive amounts of untraceable cash they needed: the cocaine trade. By this point, cocaine had already established itself as the drug of choice among wealthy Americans, creating a lucrative market that organized crime groups were eager to exploit. When crack cocaine hit the streets in the early 1980s, it transformed this already profitable business into an absolute gold mine. This smokable form of cocaine was cheaper to produce, more addictive, and generated incredible profits for anyone willing to get involved in its distribution. It was the perfect funding mechanism for covert operations that Congress had explicitly forbidden. The connections between the Contras and drug trafficking weren't hidden from the CIA. They were documented in the agency's own reports. Messages sent to CIA headquarters explicitly stated that Contra groups had decided to engage in drug smuggling to finance their operations. Initial trial runs were conducted, moving drugs from Nicaragua to Miami aboard CIA-connected aircraft. The agency knew exactly what was happening, and they made a conscious decision to look the other way. Even more damning was a memo from Attorney General William French Smith to CIA Director William Casey in 1982. This document, disguised as bureaucratic housekeeping, effectively gave CIA operatives permission to ignore drug crimes they witnessed in the field. The memo listed numerous criminal activities that agents were required to report, but drug trafficking was conspicuously absent from the list. When questions were raised about this glaring omission, Smith sent a follow-up letter that was a masterclass in legal doublespeak. Instead of adding drug crimes to the reporting requirements, he simply referenced existing federal drug policies while making it clear that CIA officers had no formal obligation to report narcotics violations they encountered during their operations. This created the perfect storm of plausible deniability. The CIA could claim they weren't directly involved in drug trafficking, while simultaneously providing cover for their assets who were flooding American cities with cocaine. They weren't pulling the triggers, but they were definitely loading the guns and pointing them at American communities. The human cost of these policies was staggering. Crack cocaine devastated entire neighborhoods, particularly in black communities that were already struggling under the weight of systemic racism and economic inequality. Families were destroyed, young people were incarcerated at unprecedented rates, and the social fabric of entire cities began to unravel. Meanwhile, the same government that was waging a war on drugs domestically was facilitating the very drug trade that was destroying American lives. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it would take years before anyone would connect these dots in a way that the public could understand. That breakthrough came in 1996, when investigative journalist Gary Webb published a series of articles called Dark Alliance. Webb had uncovered the connections between CIA-backed Contras, Nicaraguan drug dealers, and the explosion of crack cocaine in Los Angeles. His reporting traced a direct line from the jungles of Central America to the streets of American cities, showing how drug money flowed back to fund the very operations that Congress had prohibited. Webb's investigation focused on the story of Freeway Rick Ross, who had become one of America's biggest crack dealers during the 1980s. Webb discovered that Ross's supplier was a Nicaraguan exile named Danilo Blandon, who was funneling cocaine profits back to the Contras through Miami banks. Blandon worked for Norwin Meneses, a major Nicaraguan drug trafficker with deep ties to Contra leadership and apparent protection from American law enforcement. When Webb's story broke, it created a firestorm of controversy that reached the highest levels of government. The CIA director took the unprecedented step of defending the agency at public meetings, while politicians demanded investigations into these explosive allegations. But instead of launching their own investigations into CIA misconduct, major newspapers like the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and New York Times chose to attack Webb personally. They picked apart his reporting methods, questioned his sources, and effectively destroyed his career as a journalist. Webb was eventually forced out of his job and found himself blacklisted from the profession he loved. In 2004, Gary Webb took his own life. 2 years before Webb's death, The CIA's own Inspector General released a report that vindicated much of his reporting. The report confirmed that the agency had known about drug trafficking by contra-connected individuals, had done nothing to stop it, and had even protected some traffickers from investigation by other law enforcement agencies. So here's what we know for certain. The CIA didn't have agents selling crack on street corners, but they absolutely worked with and protected major drug traffickers who were flooding American cities with cocaine. They knew about the drug trafficking, they chose to ignore it, and they actively prevented other agencies from investigating it. The war on drugs was never really about protecting American communities from the scourge of addiction. It was about maintaining power, controlling dissent, and advancing foreign policy objectives regardless of the cost to ordinary Americans. The same government that was incarcerating millions of people for drug offenses was simultaneously facilitating the drug trade that was destroying those very same communities. The tragic irony is that the only people who truly paid a price for this massive betrayal were the journalists who exposed it, and the millions of Americans whose lives were destroyed by both the drugs and the laws designed to combat them. The CIA officials who facilitated this nightmare kept their jobs, their pensions, and their reputations intact. This is the dark truth behind the war on drugs, a decades-long campaign that served as cover for some of the most cynical and destructive policies in American history. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats to our communities don't come from foreign enemies or criminal organizations, but from the very institutions we trust to protect us. The next time someone tells you that government overreach is impossible in America, remember this story. Remember that your own government once waged war against its own people while secretly funding the very problems it claimed to be solving. Because until we confront these uncomfortable truths about our past, we'll never be able to build the just and equitable future that all Americans deserve.